But if you look at anything plausible amount of spending, they can finance it. I mean, it'll get financed. It'll get the money, debt will get created. The flows will be circular, and there's no real problem with that. Like, it's what's going to go wrong, and you can't really point to, like, you could say, yeah, okay, maybe 11 quadrillion dollars. Okay, that's maybe too much. But the thing is, why do you need 11 quadrillion dollars for? You don't.
Welcome to Activist MMT, a podcast about real-world economics, including modern money theory, and how life changes when you discover it. I'm your host, Jeff Epstein. Today I talk with author, financial analyst, and applied mathematician Brian Romanchuk. We talk about his journey from mainstream economics to Minsky to MMT, and his experience writing the 2021 book Modern Monetary Theory and the Recovery. He also describes some of his concerns regarding the common assertion that government spending always comes before taxation. This is part one of a three-part conversation. In parts 2 and 3, we discuss the many varied techniques used by bad faith critics of MMT, which more broadly are the techniques used by simple bullies who want their followers to think that they're not. The second two parts were inspired by Chapter 5 in Brian's book, his recent appearance on MMT Podcast, and my own post documenting several good faith critiques and the MMT responses to them, a link to which can be found in the show notes. Regarding the assertion that government spending always precedes taxation, Brian's concerns are not related to its accuracy. In my view, it remains a valuable and important insight. Rather, the problem is that it's a cycle that can only be resolved by going back, in the words of Fadl Kaboub, to the beginning of the beginning. After that, it's so close to a chicken and egg question that in the context of public conversations, it can sometimes cause more problems than it solves. Instead, Brian suggests asking why the assertion is so important. The answer is the assurance that the national government, the currency issuer, can never default on its obligations. In other words, regardless whether the chicken or the egg came first, the government can always pay its bills. If you like what you hear, then I hope you might consider becoming a monthly patron of Activist MMT. Patrons have exclusive access to several full-length episodes right now. A full list, each with a brief highlight, can be found in the show notes. Patrons also get the opportunity to ask my academic guests questions, such as my recent episode with Warren Mosler. They also support the development of my large and growing collection of Learn MMT resources. To become a patron, you can start by going to patreon.com/activistmmt. Every little bit helps a little bit, and it all adds up to a lot. Thanks. And now, on to my conversation with Brian Romanchuk. Enjoy.
So hi, how are you? What time are you?
Pretty good. What time it is? It's just after 9.
Oh, so you're right. Okay, we're in the same time zone. You're in what's city?
Montreal.
Montreal. Okay.
Where are you?
I'm right across from Philly in New Jersey.
Okay.
So about 2 hours south of New York. So okay, all right. Well, thank you for doing this. It's nice to finally meet you. And you have so
okay. Yeah, no, I got them. The I'll be honest, I haven't been worrying too much about MMT, so
You haven't been
it's just,
what?
I haven't been worrying about MMT too much recently. It's been all kinds of other issues, so I have not been keeping up with the latest controversies, whatever they are.
What's going on?
Yeah, well, I mean, I've got various projects, consulting, some of my other writing, and in terms of what's happening, it's sort of all worrying about inflation and stuff. So that's if I'm reading about that, sort of the big worry. Oh no, how much are they going to hike rates? So on and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
So,
What are your other major interests beyond like economics and MMT?
well, well, nowadays not much because it's a bit harder. I used to curl, a bit of bike riding, but yeah, you're sort of not getting out too much. I mean, play video games, read, that sort of thing. But
Okay.
yeah, it's not.
Well, to show that I don't get out too much, what's curling?
It's it's in the Winter Olympics. If you follow it at all, it's it's a game you try and get your played on ice. You're trying to get rocks into the circles. And you're trying to get them closer to the other team.
It sounds like the larger version of shuffleboard, basically.
Uh, yeah, you can't bounce off the sides, but yeah, it's a team game, and I mean there is a lot of skill. I mean it's in a sense a bit like golf, in
Hmm.
that like the way you deliver, everything has to be done correctly or you're going to miss. So it takes a lot of skill, just like for the mechanics to at least be consistent. I mean, you can get lucky shots, but to be consistent, you really have to practice, be flexible, which I'm not. And, but it's fun. But like I say, it's shut down here. It's in the Olympics, but our curling club is shut down now.
Okay. Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on. I have. Why don't we just get right into it? So,
Okay.
on MMT Podcast, you recently did.
Right.
Part of your conversation was on what we're going to get more into today. You described your journey to MMT, and I'd like to ask specifically, not to rehash that, but
Okay.
how did your discovering MMT basically change your life professionally and personally, if it did?
The like in terms of learning about MMT, I guess I have to step a little bit back before that. My training, I was engineer. Engineer is sort of, I evolved into an applied mathematician, control systems engineering, and I did a doctorate in that. But the engineering, uh, there was a recession in the mid '90s, and basically, things were a bit slow in control systems, and I ended up jumping into finance. So I came in with no formal training. I had an interest in economics. I didn't know too much about it, but I ended up working for a firm that did financial economics research. Mainly sort of programming, mathematical modeling. Later on, I had to do market commentary. The firm itself was the economists are sort of, well, they're sort of market oriented, sort of eclectic views, not really what you'd call mainstream, not academic mainstream, but conventional. A lot of them had worked at the Bank of Canada. Actually, one of them was Stephen Poloz, who ended up being the governor after he left the firm, but that's beside the point. But in terms of learning, I actually picked up a lot from Hyman Minsky. You pick up an economics textbook about macroeconomics, because it's the only thing I was interested in, and none of it made any sense. To say this is nothing, this has no relationship to what I'm seeing when I'm writing about the markets. The stuff, it's going nowhere. But you read Hyman Minsky, and oh yeah, okay, now he's talking about markets. It made sense. So, like a lot of people in markets, I would be a Minskyite. And
And I presume this is before you discovered
the,
Molzer's.
This is before I discovered MMT. Yeah. So
Okay.
so to a certain extent, and of course, like Hyman Minsky, is sort of, you could say, pre-MMT. I mean, I think there's a little bit debate, is he an MMT or not, but he was the supervisor for Randy Ray. So, obviously there's a lineage from Minsky to MMT, even if he's technically not an MMTer, but the lineage was there. So I was working for, guess you'd call it, a pension fund, and in the fixed income teams, an analyst. And I think it was after the financial crisis, and I ran into it was people from Warren Mosler's firm, and that's where I first heard of MMT. And then I said, okay, all this. It basically was interesting because it was the first time sort of say, okay, yeah, this finally makes sense, because there were certain things I hadn't thought about, sort of monetary operations I never would worried about. I just saw how interest rates acted. I never thought about digging in, okay, what are, the nuts and bolts of the underlying the system. It seemed, that wasn't my concern. And as soon as I said, and then it was basically them, and they were fixed income types. Warren, I met Warren Mosler a couple times, and that's the thing. So he worked in fixed income, so obviously we spoke the same language. It made sense. So that is how I got sort of into it, and then I sort of followed on, and to a certain extent, then I branched out and I read some of the post-Keynesian literature. And some of the post-Keynesian literature, I mean, I'd looked at it and I was not greatly impressed, but I finally ran into ones that were more useful. There was a Monetary Economics by Lavoie and Godley, which is like one of the big books, and that book was much clearer than a lot of the literature, and that one sort of helped a lot in terms of a formal understanding of economics. So, from MMT, I sort of got a better guide into the post-Keynesian literature. In terms of how it affected me, I mean, to a certain extent, you could say I was pre-MMT. There was the terms of a policy conclusion. I knew, none of these countries. I followed Japan. I knew Japan wasn't defaulting. Basically, what MMT did was it allowed me to explain what's going on in a cleaner fashion. To a certain extent, I mean, I'd looked at the data. I saw I spent my life staring at databases of interest rates and
Mhm.
debt and inflation. So I knew how everything operated. It gave me a cleaner way of explaining it. So that's sort of where it fit in. And then later on, I've decided, okay, I had enough of enough of the 9 to 5 life, or 8 to 7 or whatever it was, and I moved on. Now I moved into consulting and writing, which is what I wanted to do, and obviously the writing about MMT was enjoy. It certainly has an audience. It's interesting, and so that's part of what I do. But it's not everything I write is just MMT. It's sort of, you could say, MMT inspired, but not. It's a variety of topics. So I'm sort of going through topics of interest to me in sort of a planned order. That's basically it. That's sort of been my evolution.
Okay. Okay. Two things. One is that you read Minsky before you learned of MMT and Mosler and so on. So it seems to me that your transition to MMT was much smoother than, like, many people that I know, including myself. I mean, I didn't have an awareness of finance. You did. That's different, obviously. But like, my introduction to MMT was a complete 180 to everything else I knew. So your learning Minsky before that seemed to give you a much smoother transition into it.
Well, certainly, because I mean, one of the things I ran into is that I had to cover Japan in the early 2000s, and basically, Japan is a place where theories about government finance go to die, at least mainstream theories. Like everyone was continuously wrong. Everyone was tired about being wrong. And so it forced me to say, look, I mean, and so I had a natural skepticism. I wouldn't have, at the time, I probably didn't have good answers, but I knew, I could just point, yeah, Japan. Someone talks about debt GDP ratio, just go Japan, and that was it. So, yeah, I mean, I came in very little theory because, to be honest, like I attempted any number of times to read various mainstream economics texts, and they're just hopeless. I mean, I'm trained as an applied mathematician, and it's just like, what is this stuff? These aren't models. The economics 101 is just terrible. Here's a couple of graphs. I mean, it's not a model. And then the more advanced stuff, the dynamic stochastic general equilibrium model, or DSG. The DSG models is actually based on math, or is supposed to be based on math from control theory, like from 1960s control theory, which, I mean, it was abandoned by control engineers because it was terrible. It didn't work, like, because it's all based on optimization. And actually, well, I mean, a test pilot got killed because of it, because it's just too unstable in practice. You don't want to be running optimizations, but they can't even write out the math properly. It's like I'm saying, what are they doing? It's just, every paper you sort of reading it and say, well, that sort of looks like math, but there's always key steps where they don't know how to do it properly, and there's just these huge logical jumps. Like, so if you're following a proof, there's always a leap, and it's like, what are they doing? It's taken me years. I think I know what they're doing, but it's just embarrassing because they're not taught by real mathematicians. They're
So
taught they're taught by economists, and so they're doing economist math, and they they think they're rigorous, but unfortunately, they're not following standards.
well, they're rigorous for nonsense. It's taking
Yeah.
you years to determine why exactly it's nonsense.
Well, yeah, yeah. I mean, that should never happen.
Hmm.
I mean, I can walk into sort of any field of math. I mean, now I'm probably my brain is crusty and old. I'd probably have a hard time of it. But certainly when I was younger, I can pick up any text and you could drill down and figure it out. It might be exceedingly painful, but I know how to do it. But it's just with this stuff, it's just anything you hit something hard, it's just a blank wall, and because they're skipping steps and they're not writing things out properly.
Interesting. Okay, the other observation was, or kind of a follow-up question. Trade might be the wrong word, but did this knowledge, aside from being able to explain things more clearly, did it result in you doing or not doing trades that you would that in a different way than before you had learned this stuff? Did it actually change your trading, or only just the way you explain things?
The I mean, it's sort of. I think it'd be a bit hard to say that. I mean, because it wasn't that long before I learned MMT before I left,
Hmm.
so I can't say there was a huge amount of time. But I would say it avoids making dumb mistakes. I mean,
Yeah.
that would be it. But the thing is, I wouldn't have made those dumb mistakes in the first place, like positioning for a Japanese default, the weakness of the euro area. But the thing is, I mean, these are all things I sort of knew about before. So the like the big macro stuff, not really. The issue, I think, probably like quantitative easing. See, that's probably where it would have, the largest difference is the whole, oh, they're printing money thing. So I said, no, that's nonsense. And I don't know, without the sort of MMT knowledge, it might have been possible. I would have fallen in with everyone else. So, yeah, they're printing money. This is bad. I was pretty much an non-monetarist because I looked at the data. But I would say that's it. Like that's the one I said, nah, it's not going to work. And certainly from the research, but the recovery being slow. That you sort of saw. Although to be honest, I had a bias towards a slow recovery, and I'm not really acting as a forecaster now, and I was surprised by the speed of the recovery, but it was also a much faster. I mean, it was a much stronger fiscal response than I expected, and it was more durable than I expected. And I mean, basically, I was wrong about the number of business failures. So, but I don't know if that's MMT. That was just me being, not really a forecaster. But otherwise, I would say it's mainly in the area of avoiding mistakes. But for making money, what I did in rates, it's really relative value, and that there's not. And it's you just have to be not totally wrong about the macro background, and it's how you actually make money. You have to be able to find opportunities and mispricings, and the MMT is not really about that.
Okay. Just for context of what you were talking about before, you said that you were surprised at how quickly recovery was and that fewer businesses failed than you thought. You're talking about coronavirus?
Coronavirus,
Oh, okay.
the 2020. So, certainly, I mean, the premise of my book was that you would have, because it was written basically during the lockdowns of 2020. Publication came a bit later, and so I mean, obviously, it was in the first few months. It was like summer 2020. So there was at the time almost no data on anything that was happening because it was just trickling in. It was just the first shock. So. I was more pessimistic perhaps than I should have been about the economy on the other side, but I mean I had no idea of what would happen in the thing, and I didn't attempt to do a forecast, partly because it's a book. It's bad enough. Like it might take 6 months to finish off the book, and then doing a forecast, even if you're right, no one cares about my forecast for 2021 and 2022. So, and that's the thing is I want to keep selling the book. So I generally stayed out of the forecasting business because I want what I'm writing to have some durability.
Sure, of
But
course.
the overall premise is that we might have a slow recovery. It's actually inflation control, which I mean, you could sort of, I don't know if I wrote about it, but it was sort of, you could see there's going to be disruptions on the supply side, but, I didn't attempt to forecast it once again, but if I had forecasted, I'm pretty sure I would have been surprised by the inflation level.
Okay. One last question about like kind of you and your book, and that is, can you describe the journey of deciding to write the book? And also
Yeah.
just a minor kind of aside that I'm personally interested in is what software, I presume that you used some kind of software or language to
Yeah.
compose the book itself.
I'll deal with the language. It's actually all Microsoft Word. I mean, I used to
Oh,
use LaTeX, or
that's kind of the, yeah.
that's what I used for my thesis, all my academic work. But it has its advantages, but not actually in the environment because the books go to for an ebook is essentially a giant web page. Or each chapter is like a web page. They're all bound together into a zip file. And they just have a proprietary name for it. And Word documents, I think now are basically also XTML or XHTML or whatever. So they're close. But Word definitely, if you crank up the grammar settings, it's actually a pretty good immediate proofreader. Like it will catch. I mean, you can hire people on the internet to proofread for you, and they'll charge you $5 an hour. And what a lot of them do is they just crank up the settings on Word and they just use that. And to be honest, it's pretty good. It catches a lot of sentence structures faults, and so the spell checker. So with like LaTeX, you don't have that level of quality, and basically you do have to know how to format it to get it into an ebook. For the paperback, it goes through. I use InDesign, but that's like it has to be done in InDesign. You don't write in design; you're just formatting because the to lay out a book properly on pages, if you have figure, like if you have charts like I do, it's a challenge to get it right. If I were writing fiction, you could pretty much actually just upload a Word document, do some formatting thing, they could actually give you the paperback and it's going to be okay. But if you're worried about looking professional for a book, you've got to make sure like you don't have like two words on an otherwise empty page. You have to squeeze that up into the previous page and so on and so forth. You have to have the layout, but see that you need a good layout software to do that. But anyways, in terms of the process was slow because I wanted to do an MMT primer. That was always my plan, but my feeling was is that I really wanted to sort of have a textbook or something to back me up. And so I was waiting for the MMT textbook from Ray Mitchell and Watts, and that was delayed. I mean, I talked to them when I was still in finance, and say, "Oh, it's coming." So it was delayed much later. And to be honest, I probably should just went on without it. But I said, "I'm going to wait for it and wait for it," and because I wanted to be able to say, look, these are my, because I wanted, my books are short. They're novella length, as opposed to a novel. Like it's about 30,000, 40,000 words. They're brief. It's much easier for editing. It's dense. I have no pressure. I don't, I'm publishing myself. I don't say, like, for to go into a bookstore, I would need much thicker books, but I'm not aiming to go through bookstores, so my books are too specialized. So I just say, look, what is the absolute minimum size book I have and cover what I want so that you can read it quickly. And so that's sort of my objective. But I want to say, look, if you want more, here's some other things you can read. So I said, and I wanted that textbook as a backup. So anyways, their textbook came out, and so I started, and then the coronavirus hit. So, well, that basically said, okay, fine. So I sort of worked that in as a theme. Like there's sort of a okay. I didn't obviously have too much information, but it was sort of, it gave me sort of a bit of a theme for discussion. Although for a lot of it, it's just straight MMT. It's just a straight MMT primer. But and the other thing I wanted to do is everyone argues about MMT. So one of the things I wanted to say, look, I'm going to have a chapter of critiques, and because I figure in the long run, that it's probably the thing that people are going to go after the most, and it puts it a bit in context. Like if I sort of you explain MMT, for a lot of people, they'll say, okay, fine, but it doesn't really click until you contrast and compare. But I prefer not to just I'd like to actually explain MMT itself without continuously referring back to, well, okay, fine, we get it. Neoclassical economics is wrong, but we shouldn't just be beating up on that all day. Like it just bloats everything out, and you have all these weird arguments. Just say, look, you write your piece, ignore what the other people say, but then later on say, look, what are the critiques? And then you can say, okay, now we can put this into context. Because without that, 'cause that's what people see. Anyone who sees MMT on the internet, they see people arguing about it. So you might as well address that. And so that was another sort of thing that I wanted to slot into the book.
Mm-hmm. I'm sorry.
A traditional author has no choice. If you're with a big publisher, you have a certain amount of time, that they can get you into bookstores. And if you don't sell the books, if you don't sell, if your books aren't selling, you're going to be no longer in the bookstore. The shelf space in a bookstore is at an extreme premium. So they have to do a big publicity surge to keep their books on the shelf, and so they have no choice but these book tours. But realistically, most of my books are way too specialized. It's not going to, people are going to be ordering it online anyways, and the sales are decent. I can't complain. They're not huge. I'm not a young adult fiction writer or romance. No, they make way more sales than myself, but they sell. But the thing is, it's a steady. There's no big publicity push.
Right. Okay. All right. So thank you. Let's switch. Unless there's something more you wanted to say, let's switch to just some what I think are relatively specific economics questions.
Okay.
Some inspired from your book. Okay. So question number one is in section 5.3 of your book called Rhetorical Tricks and Money Printing. You say the following. MMT proponents argue that the issuance of money must precede its return to government via taxes or bond issuance. This logical point is given considerable weight in discussions. I am heretical with regards to the MMT consensus in that I am concerned that this point can lead to largely semantic debates. I prefer to emphasize default risk analysis that results from operations analysis. And my question is the following. I believe that the MMT's consolidated view makes the statement money must be spent before it can return to government. The consolidated view makes that always true, as I understand it. But a lot of non-MMT people consider the government not as consolidated, and when you consider it not as consolidated, that assertion can turn into very detailed debates. And I think that that's what you're suggesting. Am I correct?
Well, I mean, there's the consolidation, non-consolidation, but the problem is proceed. The day zero, like if you were creating a brand new country from scratch, then it would be true. Let's say we're going to create a brand new, let's say we create a brand new fiat currency, and boom, it comes out of existence with no pre-existing financial system. You'd probably have to, like, settlers on Mars type thing could do this, because it'd be very hard to do this in the real world. Maybe at an island or something like that. But if we start talking about the real world, previous day, before you were a fiat currency, they were usually a metallic currency. They were, at least for the modern countries I'm aware of, you grew out of various gold standard institutions. So the issue is you did have money that grew out of a previous fiat current, non-fiat currency, at a commodity currency. So then you start running into problems about, okay, where did it come from? So like you can't go back to day zero. I mean, that's sort of the issue, that like it, what if you say, look, if we take a particular day, the problem, I guess, for the sort of the MMT story is that the governments do start the day with the balance from the previous day, and the balance goes up and down. So I don't know. It's just a circular flow. The government creates money and it destroys money. And so saying, like, it's for something that's going in a circle like that, it doesn't really make sense about talking about what came first. So that is sort of the issue, because I mean, there is a guy, I don't know, on Twitter. I wasn't too greatly impressed. I never really dug into it, but I think he did like I don't know, it looked like a 50-page article going blah blah blah. Let's look what happened in Canada, and that's the thing, is that it says. Now you're starting to debate, what exactly is the meaning of, these Canadian statutes and blah, who cares? So I think you have to say, why are we interested in this in the first place? And ultimately, it's going to be default, and that's it. That basically the governments do have the ability. There isn't really a limit on how much money or how much debt they can issue, other than some very basic, like they couldn't just say, oh, I'm gonna borrow $30 quadrillion today, and that would fail. But if you look at anything plausible amount of spending, they can finance it. I mean, it'll get financed. It'll get the money debt will get created. The flows will be circular, and there's no real problem with that. Like, it's what's going to go wrong, and you can't really point to, like, you could say, yeah, okay, maybe 11 quadrillion dollars. Okay, that's maybe too much. But the thing is, why do you need 11 quadrillion dollars for? You don't.
Hmm.
I mean, it's how much are you going to spend in a 1 week period, and it really comes down to what is there a limit, and the reason why there's no limit, because in a sense, yeah, they're creating the money that it's coming out first. They have to finance like when they borrow, they have to extend financing to allow the auction to go through. Like in my book, my first book, it's MMT inspired. Like, there's no doubt that it's related to MMT, but it wasn't. It was sort of plain line. Like, I didn't attempt to go too far. I didn't say this is the MMT view, because I said, well, I'm not gonna be claiming that I'm speaking on behalf. I'm just saying, look, this is my, the way I see it. I'm inspired by MMT. It's clear. It's not stuff, but I explained it in my own words, type thing. And I use a Canadian example, and the way Canada used to be. There were no bank reserves. Like, at the end of the day, the banks had a zero balance with the Bank of Canada, or the payment system technically. And basically, in order, every day, all the transactions have to zero out between the private banks and the consolidated government. Everything has to net to zero. And so, if the government borrows, if the Ministry of Finance, they say, "Oh, we're going to borrow," the Bank of Canada has no choice but to, in essence, ship cash the other way to allow that auction to go through, and then just that's it. And that's the real eye, which you don't really think about it. It's not. Oh, well, they have to borrow it from the privates. Actually, no, it's that balance is zero, so it actually technically nets out. I mean, it's a question of the form. Like, what do they want? Money? Do they want bonds? That's sort of, and that comes down to preferences in the private sector.
Okay.
But
Okay, I'm going to do one more, and then I'm going to save the rest for after. You say in your book, you say under a section called legal analysis, you say, as one might expect from institutionalists, considerable care is taken in the analysis of the legal framework of governmental finance. This is in contrast to the assume something is true strategy preferred by many conventional economists. And then you conclude the $1 trillion coin is probably the best known implication of this research. My question is, are you saying that we discovered the $1 trillion coin was discovered simply because we chose to search in the haystack and we just happened to stumble across the needle? Is that what you're saying?
I would guess. I mean, was it Raul Carrillo? I'm not, but I mean, I believe it was actually a law student who
Carlos
did.
Mucha.
Carlos Mucha, yeah. It is an interesting sort of, okay, by the way, there's this thing in the law. It might have been intended, but it certainly wasn't common knowledge. So how widely known it was before, but certainly it was not remarked upon until that came up in discussion. So I certainly hadn't heard about it, and that seemed from what I've seen, it was a surprise to most people. But yeah, they're like the $1 trillion coin. I guess that one was very much because that is a very specific thing in U.S. legislation, and it probably doesn't exist in any other country, right? So it is a little. It's not sort of a general principle. If you want to look, let's say, at Canada, you'd have to look at, okay, what's in the guts, the various government financing acts and regulations. Are there any sorts of similar legal shticks in there. And in most cases, like from what I've seen, no one really knows the limits. Like they're just sort of they operate a certain way, they stay within certain parameters, and they don't really ever test the limits. And so no one actually even knows what would, like, there's no good case law. Okay, but what if X happens? And it's never come up, and the multiple laws are ambiguous. So it will depend. I mean, it's a legal analysis. It depends where you are, and the only people that could give you a good opinion on that are lawyers,
Hmm.
and certainly not economists, certainly not me. But like, for example, one of the things I saw was a research piece by an investment bank talking about, let's say, the United Kingdom, and they went through various things, and they said, yeah, it looks like there's no circumstance under which the bank, like if the Treasury writes a check, the Bank of England doesn't have the legal authority to bounce the check. So even though they have they have all these procedures about how the government finance work, that supposedly create a limit, there's no actual way to bounce the check. So like all their limits are just self-imposed rules, and if they aren't followed, well, actually nothing happens in the real world because the check can't bounce. I mean, that could have been incorrect. I mean, maybe that legal analysis isn't correct, but that's the thing. That's a legal issue, and studying stochastic calculus is going to help you with that. It's purely, what do the laws say? And it's not even the people working there. It's got to be lawyers, because the people working there just assume, and they, certainly the central bankers, they want to believe it works a certain way, and they don't necessarily care what the law says. So that's it. There's that. There's the legal issues, and just as also the mechanics, which are sort of well understood, and the people in the banks, but nobody worries about normally.
Okay. All right. So let's move on to the main topic. We can always go back to a few more if necessary at the end, and that is, I wanted you to come on because of the section in your book on good faith and bad faith critiques, and I had also written a post with what I see as good faith critiques, probably maybe 7 of them, and when I wrote all these notes for these questions for today, kind of surprised myself that it's almost more psychology and sociology than actual practical examples of academic criticism. But in a sense, that's kind of understandable because I can kind of wrap my head around that stuff better than I can the very specific critiques that like Thomas Pally is giving. I don't have my head around like why what he's saying is why his critiques are wrong and so on. So hopefully we can take like these tactics. So these are like the negative tactics that critics use, bad faith critics use in my view, and hopefully we can kind of link them to things that are more relevant and maybe concepts. So I'm going to start with my definition of a good faith critique, and I'm going to ask you to see if you agree with this. And my summary of a good faith critique is just essentially they treat the MMT economists and academics as if they are smart and kind people and of good faith themselves. They're not, the MMT economists are not stupid or evil. And in other words, they are worth listening to, their work is worth reading, and they define their theory via their scholarly work. And anything aside from that, in my view, is not good faith. And like I just read Thomas Pally's, like you link to Thomas Pally's, I think it's 2019 critique of MMT, forget what it's called. Man, oh man, his tone and his attitude and his insults shine much, much brighter to me than any of his academic things. Yeah. So do you agree with that summary of what?
Well, I guess there's sort of two issues. Like I would sort of say what you're describing is the attitude behind a good faith versus a bad faith critique. Like, why would someone do a good faith critique? But you don't necessarily, I mean, it's possible to do a good faith critique of someone, even if you think they're I mean, I'm not a big fan of a lot of libertarians. Let's say Rothbard, who I don't know too much about him. I think he was a raving neo-Nazi at the end, but I'm not sure. I don't know. I've read one of his books, so he didn't seem too bad. So, but in that book per se, it was just a little loony.
Today I talk with author, financial analyst, and applied mathematician Brian Romanchuk. We talk about his journey from mainstream economics to Minsky to MMT, and his experience writing the 2021 book Modern Monetary Theory and the Recovery. He also describes some of his concerns regarding the common assertion that government spending always comes before taxation. This is part one of a three-part conversation. In parts 2 and 3, we discuss the many varied techniques used by bad faith critics of MMT, which more broadly are the techniques used by simple bullies who want their followers to think that they're not. The second two parts were inspired by Chapter 5 in Brian's book, his recent appearance on MMT Podcast, and my own post documenting several good faith critiques and the MMT responses to them, a link to which can be found in the show notes. Regarding the assertion that government spending always precedes taxation, Brian's concerns are not related to its accuracy. In my view, it remains a valuable and important insight. Rather, the problem is that it's a cycle that can only be resolved by going back, in the words of Fadl Kaboub, to the beginning of the beginning. After that, it's so close to a chicken and egg question that in the context of public conversations, it can sometimes cause more problems than it solves. Instead, Brian suggests asking why the assertion is so important. The answer is the assurance that the national government, the currency issuer, can never default on its obligations. In other words, Regardless whether the chicken or the egg came first, the government can always pay its bills. If you like what you hear, then I hope you might consider becoming a monthly patron of Activist MMT. Patrons have exclusive access to several full-length episodes right now. A full list, each with a brief highlight, can be found in the show notes. Patrons also get the opportunity to ask my academic guests questions, such as my recent episode with Warren Mosler. They also support the development of my large and growing collection of Learn MMT resources. To become a patron, you can start by going to patreon.com/activistmmt. Every little bit helps a little bit, and it all adds up to a lot. Thanks. And now, on to my conversation with Brian Romanchuk. Enjoy.